Hi guys, welcome to the last part of Less is More. My name is Dan Wellman and today we'll sum up what we've learned over the course of the series. Pay attention, there will be a test. Part 1 was a general overview of what Less is and which problems in CSS it sets out to solve. Less is intended to make writing CSS quicker, easier and more organised in a way that makes it much easier to maintain. In Part 2 we looked at variables in Less, which allow us to define simple values like colours or numbers in a single place and then reuse them throughout the Less file. We saw that this both helps cut down on some of the traditional repetition that comes with writing CSS and also makes changing the values later on much easier. In Part 3 we looked at another easy way to minimise the amount of duplication when creating our style sheets, nesting. When a selector is nested inside another selector in Less, the inner selector becomes a child selector for the outer selector. So instead of having to write header, header h1, header a, etc., we can just denote the child selectors by nesting them within the parent. We also saw how to use the AND symbol to concatenate selectors instead of inserting them as child selectors. Part 4 was a roundup that looked at some of the other basic simple concepts of Less, such as the two different types of comments supported by Less, regular CSS comments that are a part of the compiled output, and JavaScript style comments that are ignored by the compiler. We also looked at some simple string escaping with the tilde character and how to interpolate values within strings using the @ character and curly braces. In Part 5 we looked at the different operations that can be performed on simple numerical values. We saw that we can add, subtract, multiply and divide, and how units are taken into consideration automatically when operations are performed. We also saw that we can operate on colours as well as numbers. In Part 6 we focused on the colour functions that Less makes available to us, giving us the ability to manipulate a colour's brightness, saturation or the amount it is faded. We can also mix colours and spin the colour wheel by a specified number of degrees. And we saw that we can combine these functions in a single variable, and that as well as providing functions to set the different colour properties, Less also gives us a range of functions for getting information about these properties as well. Part 7 looked at the simple math functions provided by Less. These worked in a very similar way to the colour functions, but are used to either round a decimal or convert a decimal to a percentage. In Part 8 we looked at the simplest form of mixin, in which no parameters or other advanced features are used. We saw how mixins are a fantastic way of avoiding repetition in CSS and essentially allow us to wrap up not just a single value, as in a variable, but a whole set of values into a single component that we can reuse or distribute easily to others. In Part 9 we looked at a slightly more advanced version of a mixin that is able to accept parameters to reuse inside the mixin. This makes parametric mixins much more flexible than those we looked at before. They allow us to reuse a block of code that can output different values when different arguments are input. Part 10 we continued looking at mixins, this time focusing on how to use conditional logic mixins that can output different CSS either when different values are passed in or when a different number of arguments are passed in. So very much like a switch statement but for CSS. In Part 11 we concluded our inside out look at mixins with guarded mixins, which is similar in concept to pattern matching mixins, but where expressions built using the when keyword are used to match on instead of just simple values. Namespacing was the subject of Part 12, and in this part we saw how we can wrap up related chunks of code in wrappers. Once a variable or mixin has been wrapped up in a namespace, we just use the name of the namespace followed by a greater than sign to access the variable or mixin that we want to use. In Part 13 we hooked up the Less.js JavaScript compiler to have our CSS compiled on the fly in the browser. We also looked at using JavaScript evaluation to access the browser's JavaScript environment in order to calculate the width of the browser. We finished up in Part 14 by dissecting the awesome grid generation technique created by FAT and used in Twitter's Bootstrap framework, a great, if somewhat advanced example of using Less in a practical real-world application. I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to Less CSS and can see its potential in helping us to write more maintainable, better organised and less repetitious CSS. If you've got the Less bug and are keen to try out some more, I'd strongly recommend downloading Twitter's Bootstrap from GitHub and having a play with the Less files it is based on. Thanks for watching!